Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Dr. Shira Weiss of the Sacks-Herenstein Center of Yeshiva University, and I'm delighted to be joined tonight by Adam Kirsch to discuss a particularly relevant and provocative topic that's the focus of his latest book on settler colonialism, ideology, violence, and justice, which was recently published by W.W. Norton. Adam is an editor of the Wall Street Journal's Week in Review section and is a poet, a literary critic, and award-winning author of multiple books. So Adam, thanks so much for joining us tonight. You've been a judge in the Rabbi Sacks Book Prize for the past few years, and I always appreciate the insights that you offer on the books we review. So I'm particularly eager to hear your insights about your own work tonight. And for our audience, you can type a question in the chat over the course of our conversation, and hopefully there'll be time to address a few of them at the end. Okay.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm really glad to be here, and thanks to everyone who's joined us tonight.
Okay, so I'd like to start by describing your motivation. What was your motivation for writing this book in the aftermath of October 7th? And after you write how you witnessed celebrations of Hamas claiming justified resistance against the settler colonialism of Israel?
Right. Well, so in the immediate aftermath of the attack, there's so much has happened since both here and in Israel uh, in the year plus since the Hamas attack. But what struck me about it right away, sort of on the first day that we began to hear about it here in the U.S., was that there was this spontaneous sort of positive celebratory reaction among certain groups of people. You saw it on certain university campuses, and you saw it on certain progressive organizations. And there were people, groups would issue statements about the attack, saying that it was justified resistance to settler colonialism. And some people were quoted, certain college professors, as talking about being exhilarated and excited by the attacks. It was very striking to me because it was the first time in the history of this Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has been going on for so long, that I can remember people in the U.S. actively celebrating the deaths of Israelis, saying, I think we're used to the idea of people criticizing Israel for causing Palestinian deaths. But this was the first time that I remember people saying it was a good thing to kill Israeli civilians, women and children, and that this was sort of part of a justified struggle against the state of Israel. And I think that initial reaction that we saw at the very beginning has sort of developed and grown in various ways since then, particularly in the campus protests, which we've seen gotten a lot of news coverage, but also on social media and other places where people talk about this issue. I think that there's sort of been we've entered a new phase in the way that people, particularly in the US and particularly young people, think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In the book, I cite a poll that was taken, I think it was in November 2023, about a year ago, which asked people, Americans, who do you support, Israel or Hamas? And traditionally, when that question is asked, about 80% of Americans say they support Israel. And that remains true from all age groups except ages 18 to 24. And there it's about 50-50. So I think that there's been this real shift. And one of the causes of the shift, maybe not the only cause, but I think an important one, is this idea of settler colonialism, which is a sort of way of thinking about history, not just the history of Israel, but also the history of the United States and other countries, which sees colonialism as a sort of explanation for a lot of things that are wrong in the world today, even many years later, years after the original colonization took place. And I had been sort of aware of this term, settler colonialism, and I knew that it was popular and prominent in a lot of areas of study in the academy, like history, but also gender studies and environmental studies. It's a term that comes up a lot. And I thought that this was a moment when it would be useful to sort of look at what do people mean when they say settler colonialism, what's the sort of background of this idea, who are the people who write about it, and what are the implications that it has for contemporary politics, including Israel.
So you mentioned the college campuses, you mentioned a couple of organizations, but can you flesh out, can you explain this phenomenon of how Hamas's massacre of Israelis on October 7th, even before any Israeli response, didn't mute pro-Palestinian support, but rather amplified it. And certainly not just in Gaza and the West Bank, but as you mentioned, in Ivy League campuses, in organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America, in movements like Black Lives Matter. Can you explain this phenomenon that we were witnessing?
So I think that for a lot of people in these areas in academia and on the left for a long time, at least I'd say a generation, have grown up thinking about Israel as a sort of a symbol, a representative of a lot of the things that they see as wrong with the world in general. And this gets back to the idea of settler colonialism, the idea that Israel is a settler colonial state, which essentially means it's a state founded against the will of the people who lived there before it existed, which in this case are the Palestinian Arabs. And that a similar story can be told about the history of the United States with Native Americans, or Canada or Australia with Aboriginal Australians. And that Israel is sort of the latest and the most current example of this kind of settler colonialism. And so when people fight back against settler colonialism, I think that for many people on the left and many progressives, that is sort of by itself supposed to be a virtuous thing. Because if settler colonialism is the source of sort of the main source of problems in our world today, then anyone who fights against it is on the right side. Even if it is Hamas, which is, of course, an Islamic fundamentalist movement, which in many ways is directly opposed to everything that progressives, for example, would say that they believe in. There's no actual issue or political question on which these people would see eye to eye. But if you see the struggle against settler colonialism as a sort of international struggle, then everyone who is on that side fighting against it is on the right side, on the heroic side. And one way to think about it is by analogy with the way that people thought about third world revolutionary movements in the 1960s, when it was common also on US college campuses to have people celebrating, North Vietnam or Mao's China, places where they would never actually want to go and live, but which they saw, or Fidel Castro's Cuba, as sort of representing liberation against the imperialism of the United States or other Western countries. And so I think that for a lot of these people, having spent for many years thinking about Israel as a sort of source and symbol of the world's problems, of this evil of settler colonialism, and also being used to the idea that there are these repeated conflicts between Israel and Hamas.
Online. I'm taking a class on my phone.
I'm sorry, please 1 second. I'm sorry. We'll mute that
Yeah,
person.
just want to make sure everyone.
Sorry, Adam, can you unmute yourself? We had to just unmute everybody. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Okay, no, I've unmuted myself. So when you actually see someone fighting back against settler colonialism, I think for a lot of people, as they said quite openly, that this was exhilarating because they're used to seeing conflicts in which Israel sort of has a massive advantage over Hamas and Palestinian forces in Gaza. And of course, that's what's happened in the year since the attacks, is that Israel has invaded Gaza and the war has killed many more people than were killed in the original attacks. And if you look at the sort of history of these periodic fights between Israel and Hamas, usually the death toll has been very lopsided, that Hamas is not able, it's not as militarily powerful, and it's not able to kill as many Israelis as Israel is able to kill Hamas fighters and civilians in Gaza. And so on October 7th, it was the first time that Hamas was able to kill a large number of Israeli civilians. And so I think that for a lot of people, that was like, we've won a victory. This is our side is showing that we're capable of fighting back effectively. And it was very eye-opening to me because it showed to what an extent people are so hostile to Israel and Israelis that they don't think of them as civilians sort of killed in a war, but as targets of the war, sort of legitimate targets of the war. And I quote in the book a couple of statements and reactions to that effect where people would say things like, Israelis are not civilians, they're settlers, and settlers are not like civilians, they're legitimate targets. So it's all a way of thinking about and framing this conflict that leads to a sort of deep hostility to Israel and Israelis, and a feeling that the state of Israel, should be destroyed and that Israelis should be killed as part of that process.
backtrack a bit to the origins of the theory of settler colonialism in the US, Canada, and Australia, countries that were founded by European settlers on land taken from indigenous people. Can you explain a little bit about the background of this theory, and then how Israel is different than the settlements that created the US, Canada, and Australia, and why is it considered now the same sort, or being used in comparison to the same sort of settler colonialism?
So the history gets a bit complicated, but one thing, sort of a good starting point would be to say, as Americans, we all know that America was founded by British and then later other Europeans coming to settle on and conquer land for Native Americans. That is sort of the history of our country. Everyone learns about it starting in elementary school. It's on our maps. All the Indian names on our maps show that this is what happened. And that over a course of 3 centuries, which involved a lot of sort of border wars and fighting, eventually America, the United States, sort of took over the entire continent and reduced Native Americans to reservations, right? And that is the sort of the history of American settlement. And it used to be that was seen as sort of a self-evidently good thing, that was the story of American history. It was America conquering a continent and bringing civilization to it and spreading from ocean to ocean. And that is an idea that in the 19th century was called manifest destiny. It was the destiny of the United States to occupy the whole continent. And that was not really seen as a source of sort of illegitimacy of the country that was created in that way until fairly recently. And I think that the origins of this way of looking at American history, and also the history of some of these other countries, it has to do with the decolonization movement after the Second World War, when a lot of European empires sort of dissolved and lost or gave up land that they had occupied in Asia and Africa. And there were struggles against these European empires. Some places the empires just sort of picked up and left, which is what happened in India and also in Israel, where the British decided we don't want to be here anymore, and they just withdrew and left the people who were there to sort of fight it out among themselves. And there were other examples where there was a very extended fight against the European empire to make it leave. That's what happened to the French in Vietnam and in Algeria. But in those cases, the decolonization struggle was you would have a small European population. In Algeria, it was maybe 10%. In places like India, it was a very small population. And the idea was, we're going to tell the occupiers and the colonizers to leave, take back the land and the power, and return it to the 90+% of the population that are the natives, who are the ones who really belong to the land and should be in charge. And then in the 1990s, this idea of decolonization sort of started to be applied by some academic theorists, who I talk about in the book, to countries like the United States and Australia. And that sets up a very different kind of dynamic, because you can't really decolonize the United States or Australia or Canada in the same way that you could Algeria, because here in those countries, the process of settlement began so long ago and was so complete that there is no really a very small native population left. It's not like there's 90% natives who want to expel 10% occupiers. It's more like 98% of the population are descended from settlers and immigrants, and there are maybe 2% of the population that is descended from original native or indigenous peoples. And in that 2%, usually most people have mixed ancestry of some kind. So when you say that the United States or Canada is a settler colonial country, on the one hand, you're just saying a fact about its history, right? That's a fact about its history. But the reason why I talk about it in the book as an ideology is because it's not simply a description. It's a way of saying these countries that were founded in this way through settlement are permanently illegitimate, that even to this day, 200 or 400 years later, these countries are occupiers. They're not the legitimate sort of sovereigns or rulers of their territory. And in an ideal future, they would be decolonized. They would cease to exist. But even if that's not feasible, that there are things that we can do to sort of change society, to decolonize it spiritually or mentally or economically. And so it becomes a sort of form of social criticism or political criticism of the United States or these other countries, saying these are countries that were born in this original sin, this act of conquest. Everything about these countries today flows from that original sin and bears the imprint of it. And so we have to try to decolonize them by getting rid of things that either remind us of or are legacies of this original settlement. And I talk about a lot of examples in the book, and I can just mention one or two.
Yes.
One One example is something that you may have encountered if you've been to a university or say a museum or a performing arts company in the last 5 years, is the land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement is a sort of official statement in which an institution says, we are on the land that used to belong to a certain Native American people, and it names the tribes that used to be on that territory, and then usually makes some kind of apology saying, we're trespassers on their land, or we are enjoying our privileges illegitimately, or at the very least, we sort of don't really have, this really isn't really our place, it's their place, and we're sort of visiting it. And it's a way of saying, sort of reframing American history as saying, America and the things that came with America are sort of these latecomers, these usurpers on this land. And we always need to remember that really, ultimately, the land belongs to Native Americans who lived here 200, 300, 400 years ago. Those have gone, I think, from 0 to 100 very quickly. Like, I think maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago, no one knew what a land acknowledgement was. I think they really started in Australia and Canada. And then very quickly they became sort of part of the etiquette, so that every university, certainly, I don't know if Yeshiva University has one, but almost every university has one. And you will see it, as any kind of formal introduction or public event, they will read the land acknowledgement. It very quickly became this sort of ethical thing. Like, if you don't have a land acknowledgement, you're neglecting your responsibilities, or a bad person, or a bad institution. So when you look at the history of those countries, then you compare them to the history of Israel, they're obviously very different in almost every way. They're different in terms of time scale, in terms of geographic size. They're different in terms of how these countries were started, the number of people who started them. And we can get into that in more detail. But I think the thing that makes Israel very conspicuous and puts it at the center of this debate is that it's the only settler colonial country in the world where there's an active armed attempt to destroy it. So if you think that settler colonialism is the sort of fundamental evil in the modern world, and you know that you can't really fight it with guns in the United States or in Canada, but in Israel, you see people who want to destroy the state and say, you don't belong here, we're going to try to undo the Jewish settlement, we're going to undo the state that was created in 1948. Hamas doesn't discuss themselves in terms of settler colonialism, but Western leftists and academics do think of it that way. They say, in their view, Palestinian Arabs are sort of like the Native Americans of Israel, and Israel came and took their land, and that this is a fight to get it back. And while Hamas doesn't use that language, they use religious language, there are some Palestinian activists who do talk about themselves as an indigenous people and do talk about Israel in terms of settler colonialism increasingly over the last 10 years, because they know that it's a very powerful language for American audiences, especially young people. It frames the conflict in a way that sort of puts their sympathies automatically on one side.
What are some of the specific differences that you alluded to between Israel versus the settlements created by the US, Canada, and Australia?
I talk about it in the book and try to do justice to all the sides of this, and it is a very, I think, historically and morally complicated issue. The origins of the state of Israel, sort of in modern times, began in the 1880s with the rise of Zionism as a political movement among European Jews, which said, we're going to return to the land and build a Jewish state in the traditional biblical Jewish homeland. There had been Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel in ancient times. The Second Temple was destroyed in the year 70, the first century CE. And so 1800 years later, there had been different levels of Jewish settlement in the land of Israel over that time, gradually decreasing. It fell under sort of Christian and then Muslim rule for many centuries. And by the 18th century, the Jewish population was very small, but starting to rise as more European Jews settled there. And then in the 1880s, there was a sort of a conscious political movement saying, the Jews have no future in Europe. We need to go back to our ancestral homeland and create a state there, or else we will not be able to survive in Europe. And that proved, of course, to be even more true than the original Zionists thought. They weren't expecting anything like the Holocaust. They just thought, we will always be outsiders here. We will always be discriminated against and persecuted. So if you look at the process of settlement, or the process of sort of settlement of Israel versus other countries, one of the main characteristics of settler colonialism in a place like the US or Canada or Australia was that it spread over an entire continent and sort of evicted or destroyed the native people. And that is obviously not the case in Israel. Israel is an extremely small country. It's about the size of New Jersey. And what I say in the book is that it did not erase or replace the native population, but it did displace the native population. The Jews who began to settle in what was then the Ottoman Empire in the province of Palestine and then under British rule, originally sort of lived among Arabs, and then in the 1948 war, about 750,000 Arabs either fled or were expelled, or a combination of both, in that war, and that sort of made the modern state of Israel possible in the form that it has today. So it's a very small territory. It doesn't involve the kind of destruction and genocide that people think of when they think of settler colonialism. It didn't involve military conquest at the hands of a European empire, which is the way that these other places became parts of European empires when an army from Britain or France landed. That, as we know, the settlement of modern Israel was done by sort of small groups of refugees and volunteers. And then finally, and what's most important, in a Jewish context, is that Zionism was self-consciously a movement about indigenous people returning to their land. So in terms of settler colonial theory, and when these academics discuss it, it's very clear that to them, the Israeli Jews are white European colonists in the same way that the British were white European colonists in North America, and that they came and took land from an indigenous people who were not white, right, Palestinian Arabs. And so it comes to overlap and sort of resemble situations that we're familiar with in American history or Australian history. But in fact, the whole point of Zionism was that it was a return to the Jews' native land. And so what I say in the book is that if you could imagine what it would look like to decolonize the United States, or say you wanted to decolonize part of the United States, and Native Americans from around the country decided they were going to say, take Arizona and make it a native homeland and return there and create their own society and speak their own language. That is really what the creation of Israel was. It was a decolonizing or reclaiming an indigenous homeland that people had been expelled from many centuries before. And so I think that for all those reasons, settler colonialism is not really a good or revealing way to think about what's going on in Israel right now, its history or the future. And in particular, and I think this is the most important point, this is really what I come to at the end of the book, is that if you see Israel as a settler colonial country that was imposed on Palestinian Arabs violently and sort of doesn't have any right to exist or to be there, then the only solution to the conflict is to end that Jewish state, which is what many opponents of Israel have always wanted in the Arab world. But now it's sort of become an open desire on the American left, or at least parts of it, and in parts of academia, to say, the end game here is not peace, and it's not a two-state solution, and it's the end of the Jewish state, that a Jewish state should not exist. And so I think that's one reason why the debate over Zionism in Israel has become so much more inflamed and hostile in the last year than it was in the past, is that it's moved into this new mindset where a Jewish state sort of ipso facto should not exist. And the end game that people are working for is the end of the Jewish state.
You mentioned the ideology of settler colonialism, and in a chapter that you entitled The Palestine Paradigm, you write, Palestine is the reference point for every type of social wrong. So why in the academic study of settler colonialism, why are all social wrongs compared to Palestine?
It's a remarkable phenomenon that I think people who don't see this stuff, this world, don't study it, and don't read the sort of things that people are reading in academic theory or in progressive circles, may not realize how central Palestine is to the sort of whole universe of discourse. But there's sort of a conscious effort to say that whenever there's a social problem or a political problem in the world, that sort of Palestine is the ultimate example of it. And I give some different examples in the book, but you see it in, like, British environmental groups talk about the environmental damage in Gaza as a sort of paradigm of environmental damage in the world, or mental health problems as the sort of ultimate example of how war affects people's mental health is in Palestine. And it's a sort of map of the world where this one really, very small conflict in terms of the number of people involved comes to be at the center, and much bigger conflicts, much bigger wars and genocides and things that you might think were more worthy of attention sort of don't even exist, or they're on the margins. And I think that this is one way in which Israel, the state of Israel, has sort of inherited the role of the Jews in Western civilization, Western society, is that when the larger society thinks about problems and wickedness, the Jewish state is sort of the most available example of them. So this is a classic pattern in Western civilization where you'd say, well, we Christians don't do X, but Jews do it. Like, we're not greedy, or we don't care about money, but Jews do care about money. We don't lend it interest, but Jews, of course, it's a way of sort of scapegoating, of saying everything that we don't like about ourselves or don't want to acknowledge in ourselves, we will project it onto the Jews. And I think that a lot of that is going on with Israel in the way that it's talked about today. There's this sort of very extreme, for example, the way that the war in Gaza is described as a genocide, which is not true in any sort of conventional or usual sense of the term genocide. It's just two different things. It is a very bloody war in which many civilians have been killed, and in that sense, it's completely natural and to be expected that people would be horrified by it, because it is horrifying. But the idea that Israel is committing genocide of Palestinians is just clearly not the case. It's not substantiated by anything that's happened there, either recently or in the past. So when that charge is constantly brought against Israel, and I think that in the left, American left today, that's sort of the price of admission. Like, if you won't say that what's happening there is a genocide, you can't even enter the conversation. That it suggests that everything Israel does is sort of seen in the most evil, the most heightened terms. And I really think that it's because it's become a symbol of all kinds of things in the past of European and Western civilization that people are turning against. They say all these things that happened in the past in our countries, like colonialism or genocide, now they're happening in Israel, and now we can sort of blame them on Israel.
You mentioned that many of us are not well versed in the academic studies of settler colonialism. Can you explain the mantra of these studies that, as Australian historian Patrick Wolf writes, invasion is a structure, not an event? Can you explain and flesh out this idea?
Well, so that is a phrase that's often quoted. It's quoted in a lot of, to write this book, I looked at a lot of books and also academic papers in scholarly journals and other kinds of writing. Some of it directed at a popular audience, but mostly written by scholars for other scholars or for students. And it's a sentence that's quoted a lot. It comes from a book written in 1998. And in the original book is about Australia. It's about the history of Australia. And Patrick Wolf he's no longer living, but he was an Australian anthropologist. And the book was really about how anthropologists helped to shape the way that Australians thought about Aborigines. That's sort of the main subject of the book. But in the introduction of the book, he talks about settler colonialism as a phenomenon, and he says, invasion is a structure, not an event, by which he means you may think that the invasion of Australia by the British happened in 1788, right? You might think that it's an event that happened 200 years ago. Or if you apply it to America, you may think that the settlement of the United States is something that happened in the 17th century. But by saying that it's actually a structure and not an event, what he's saying is these aren't things that happened in the past and that history has sort of developed from, but rather everything about these societies today is equally responsible for genocide, for conquest, for colonialism, and is shaped by them, bears the imprint of them, sort of is cast in the image of these original sins, and is sort of responsible for it. So that you can't say, as you might say, these are tragic or unjust chapters in our country's history, but rather the country itself is sort of an ongoing act of conquest and genocide. And that informs the way that a lot of people talk about things that might seem like they have nothing to do with conquest or genocide or settler colonialism. For example, national parks or coal mining. Those are both things that have been attacked as examples of settler colonialism because if the way you're thinking is America doesn't really have the right to the land that it occupies, this is really native land, and America is sort of sitting on top of it, then it doesn't have the right to dig up coal out of the land and destroy the environment, and it doesn't have the right to say that you can't live in certain parts of the land because they're national parks. All of these are sort of interfering with native sovereignty, which is sort of fundamentally what we should still be having, even after so many years and so many changes. And it's a strange way of looking at history because it basically says that history sort of doesn't exist or shouldn't exist in a certain way, that things that have changed shouldn't have happened, and that the ultimate goal is to try to go back to this original starting point, go back to this moment sort of before the settler colonization began, and sort of recreate the world that existed then, which is something that can't be done, not just because for practical reasons, but the world of the 21st century is completely different from the world of the 16th century. There's no one in the world lives the way that Native Americans lived before Columbus arrived. So it becomes a sort of almost a sort of fantasy or a dream about all of the ways in which our society could change or be better, that we might not use natural resources, not to spoil the environment, not have economic inequality, not have gender inequality. Whatever the issue is that people are concerned about, it's attributed to settler colonialism. And so if we could undo the settler colonialism, we could get back to this sort of utopian world that used to exist.
So when viewing invasion as a structure or this ongoing act of previous injustices, it raises a lot of ethical questions. What are our moral obligations today in response to historical injustices?
I mean, it's a big question. I think it's a question that in America we've been debating in various ways, probably for about 10 years. And often when we talk about that, we're talking about the history of slavery and race. And there was a lot of debate about that in terms of, should we rename things named after figures from American history, or take down statues of the founding fathers who owned slaves. That's another version of this question, which is the history of any country is full of good and bad things. It's full of things to celebrate and things to despair and mourn over. And how do we sort of remember the past in a way that does justice to both of those things, that allows us to tell the truth about the past, but doesn't say we are sort of living in a crime, we're living in an ongoing crime, we're responsible for an ongoing crime. Because in sort of basic ways, that doesn't fit with people, with the reality that we experience or the way we think about ourselves. A good example is one thing that settler colonialism, this ideology, frequently insists on is that everyone is either a settler or indigenous. So in order to be a settler in the United States, you don't have to be, someone who came over on the Mayflower or someone whose ancestors came over on the Mayflower. If you are not Native American, you're a settler. And that could be, you could have come here from Hong Kong 20 years ago. Your ancestors could have come here as slaves from Africa. All of those groups are included as settlers, because if you're not indigenous, you're a settler. And it's a good example of the way that you can't really understand the past in those terms. You can't make sense of the world we live in or why things are the way they are by saying everyone is a settler except some people, and those are the people who had ancestors here 600 years ago. It doesn't make practical sense or moral sense. When you apply it to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's, I think, much more complicated, because for all of the sort of ink that's spilled on this subject in America, no one actually thinks that America is going anywhere anytime soon. I mean, there are people, and I do quote people who say, one day the United States will disappear and Native history will continue, or we dream about it. In fact, often they talk about it in much the same way that the early Zionists talked about the Jewish state. They would say, Im Tirtzu, if you dream about it, it could happen, even though they're not really kind of clear on exactly what the steps would be to get us there, what it would look like. But Israel is a different situation because it's a much more recently founded country. As you know, it's only 76 years old, one human lifetime. And it's a country where, unlike in these sort of other countries that are the classic spots of settler colonialism, you did not have one people replace another people. That is, in fact, why there's a conflict. That's why there is an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is because you did not have the kind of genocidal replacement that you had in those places. Right now, between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, between the river and the sea, as the slogan goes, there are about equal numbers of Jews and Arabs, about 7.5 million each. And so it's sort of one thing that is striking about the way we talk about Israel and people who talk about it a lot take this for granted, but I think people who aren't versed in the subject and don't think and talk about it a lot find it very strange, is that so much of the conversation is about specific historical events and who was right and who was wrong within the last 100 years. So there are all of these turning points. There's the Balfour Declaration, and there's the Peel Commission of 1937, which was going to partition Palestine between Jews and Arabs, and there's the UN decision of 1947, and there's the 1967 war and the occupation territories and the withdrawal from Gaza. All of these things, which to people who are versed in this history, are really ways of saying who is at fault in this situation. Whose fault is it? Is it the Jews' fault for taking Arab land? Is it the Arabs' fault for attacking Jews who were trying to coexist with them? Who failed to take the opportunity for peace? One area of this is, the peace talks of the 1990s, which ultimately failed. What did Israel offer? Was it enough? Was it the Palestinians' fault for not accepting? Though there are all these ongoing debates, and because really what we're trying to think about and talk about is, should this country have been created? Was it wrong for this country to have been created in the first place? Or was there a moment at which, it could have been created peacefully and it was because of Arab opposition that it wasn't? It's a very complicated question that a lot of people give different answers to. What I try to say in the book is, I look at the question from the Palestinian point of view and talk about some of the Palestinian historians who have written about it, like Rashid Khalidi of Columbia University, who wrote a book called The War on Palestine, or 100 Years War on Palestine. From the perspective of the Palestinian national story, it is a colonial story of Jews start coming in small numbers, and then when the British take over and say they sort of throw open the gates to the Jews, at least for a period of about 10 years, and there's tens of thousands of immigrants, that this was an example of a European empire coming and taking Arab land and handing it over to Jews, who the native people, the Arabs, didn't want there. And because the Palestinians have sort of lost at every stage of this conflict, they didn't prevent the Balfour Declaration, they didn't prevent the Yishuv from forming, they didn't win the war in 1948 to stop the state of Israel, and they didn't win in 1967. All of these conflicts, or the Intifada since then, Israel has won all of those conflicts, and that's why the state exists, is because it was able to prevail. So I think that the Palestinian national narrative is largely, we are the victims of this sort of conquering Jewish people that came and took our land. And I think it's important not to ignore the truth in that is, for a lot of Palestinians, the truth of their history. It's the truth of people whose ancestors were expelled in 1948, and it's certainly true for a lot of people who currently live in the West Bank under Israeli rule and have no, voting rights and no civil equality, no legal equality. Those are real problems and real injustices that can't be sort of explained away and ignored. At the same time, I think that when people say the Jewish state should never have been created, or Zionism is a form of racism, or Zionism is a form of genocide, that as Jews, what we have to be able to say in response to that is that returning to our sort of ancestral homeland in Israel and creating a Jewish state was both necessary. It was necessary for the survival of the Jewish people, and it was just. It was just to be able to return to our ancestral homeland and create a Jewish state, the only Jewish state in the world. And in order to achieve that good and just result, it had to come in the form of conflict with Arabs. You could say that maybe there didn't have to be a conflict, or if the different leadership wouldn't have been a conflict. But I talk in the book about Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was one of the leading Zionists of the early 20th century, who basically said, at a time when a lot of the other early Zionists, like Theodor Herzl, were sort of ignoring the Arabs. They were sort of saying, we'll solve that problem when we come to it, or they'll be glad when we show up and create this Jewish state because everyone will benefit. That was sort of the official Zionist view. Jabotinsky, who was considered very right-wing by those other Zionists, said in a famous essay in 1923 called The Iron Wall, he said, the Arabs feel about this land the way every people feel about the land that they occupy, which is that they don't want to give it up to someone else. And the only way that we are going to be able to create a state with a Jewish majority is to build an iron wall, by which he meant an armed force to protect us. And at the time he meant the British, because the British were ruling. But later that role sort of was handed over to the Israeli military, and it still exists today, that there's this, it requires armed defense. So there was a conflict, and certainly the moment Zionism decided we're going to take Jews from Europe and put them in Palestine, a conflict was being established. And you can't deny that that conflict exists or that continues to exist, but that also doesn't mean that the state shouldn't exist. I think that there's a way to solve that problem that acknowledges the justice of both sides.
To that end, if decolonization is impossible, how do you suggest we remedy this conflict or approach some sort of reconciliation? You suggest at the end of the book by, quote, recognizing that the wounds we inherit can't be undone, but perhaps they can be healed even if they're guaranteed to leave a scar. Can you explain what you mean?
Well, when I talk about the book, I'm always asked that, and I always say, if I had the answer, I would be happy to tell you, and I could win a Nobel Peace Prize. I don't have the answer. I say in the book, I talk about the Talmudic, the halachic concept of yeush, which means despair in the context of civil law. It means it has to do with the law of lost and stolen objects, and it's basically a principle that says that if you've lost something, even if you didn't mean to lose it or if it was stolen from you, that you are no longer the legal owner of it. You deserve compensation, you're entitled to compensation, but you don't own the actual item. And the reason why that law is instituted in the Talmud is that there's a discussion of it. They give the example, if you had a donkey confiscated by a tax collector, and then the tax collector sold it to a third person, that person sold it to someone else. If that donkey remained your property, then you could go to whoever ended up buying it and take it back from them. And then that person would have had an injustice committed against them because they bought it thinking that they were, buying something, and then they would be out. The person who committed the theft isn't the one who pays in that case. It's whoever happens to be in possession of the item. And there's an analogy, I think, with these historical injustices. You could say, ideally, there would never have been European settlement in North America, and Native Americans would never have lost control of the continent. But that doesn't mean that now we who are living on it 600 years later, 500 years later, should be the ones to pay that price, right? That everything that's happened since, or the society that we live in now, is not responsible for remedying the original injustice. We can't remedy it in that way, but we can be cognizant that there was an injustice and think about ways to alleviate it. And so one of the ways that America has tried to do that is through the idea of tribal reservations, that there are areas of land that Native peoples are sovereign over and that they sort of govern themselves on. Although in practice, it's usually not quite as happy a solution. In the context of Israel and Palestine, there's no real vision right now of a two-state solution coming to pass. It's something that no one on either side really believes in or wants, but it's something that appeals to American Jews like me because it does seem like the only solution that does not involve compounding the injustice. I mean, the alternatives, I think, are the status quo, or one people evicts the other people and takes over, which is what, when people say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, that's what they mean. They mean the end of the Jewish state, getting rid of the Jews. Or some on the Israeli right want to get rid of the Arabs and take over Gaza, take over the West Bank. To me, either of those would involve so much suffering and so much death and violence and lead to so much lasting revenge and hatred, that they're not real solutions. They wouldn't solve a problem. They would create more and worse problems. And so the only solution that I could see would be a way for these peoples to live side by side in a way that's peaceful and secure for both. What that is and how it comes to pass, I don't know. It seems utopian right now. But there was a time when Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland were killing each other, and people thought they could never live together. And now it seems very possible that Northern Ireland will join the Catholics in Southern Ireland and make one country. Things can change, and they can change, first on the individual scale and then hopefully on a larger scale. Of course, in the middle of a war is not the time when people think about that, and so I don't know what the future holds.
Right. You conclude your book by suggesting that European settlement of America should not be undone, but Native people should have the power to define and protect their way of life. And similarly, the state of Israel, you write, should not be negated. But as you just mentioned, Palestinians should have the security and dignity of their own homeland. And certainly during a war, it's hard to kind of perceive the viability, in such a climate. Renowned Professor Michael Walzer recently reviewed your book in the Jewish Review of Books, and he wrote that your arguments point the way towards a politics of imperfect justice and peace. What do you think he meant by that?
I think that imperfect justice and peace means no one is going to get what they want, but maybe there's a way in which people can live peacefully without getting everything that they want. That is sort of, I think that the way conflicts end, not just this conflict, but just in general, is either one side wins and the other is completely defeated, or people learn to live with less than they originally want. They decide we'd rather have peace in the status quo, or an imperfect status quo, than continue fighting this war, continue fighting with each other and killing each other. The problem is that I think the Israelis and Palestinians both are so mistrustful. There's zero trust on either side. You can't make peace with people who you don't trust. And I think that became clear in the 90s when ostensibly people were trying to make peace with the Israelis and the PLO, and they were not able to come to a peace agreement, because if you're really going to live with someone side by side, you have to trust that when you make that agreement, they're going to keep it and not use it as an excuse to try to kill you. And I don't think that Israelis believe that certainly not about Hamas and not about the Palestinian state in the West Bank. And I think that they're right not to believe it. I think that their experience is every time you give an inch, it becomes, a new attack, a new war front. So I think that it's very understandable why no one wants to settle this. But at the same time, I think if you look at the war that's been going on in Gaza for the last 14 months, you realize the reason why that war can't end is because you can't change the fundamental fact, which is that there are 2 million Arabs living there, and that they have to, have a government. And so if it's not the Hamas government, it has to be some other government. Well, then which one? I don't think Netanyahu knows or has a plan for who's going to be in charge. Or there has to be an occupation, and then what are the costs of that occupation? So the facts of the conflict are so intransigent that people sort of wish that they could change or fantasize about ways they could change. But the fact remains that at the end of the day, you do have 7 million Jews and 7 million Arabs living in this small territory. What is the end game without taking account of that fact?
What are the larger political implications of the theory of settler colonialism?
I think that it's applied in a lot of ways, especially in America. One way of putting it is that it sort of puts you in a position to criticize absolutely everything in the most extreme way. You say this country is built on settler colonialism, therefore the economy is unjust, and family structure is unjust, and environmental policies are unjust. And what else can you expect, because it all began with settler colonialism? So in a way, it's a very useful sort of all-purpose concept, because it can be applied to basically anything. And I cite a couple of examples in the book where people say things like, the idea of getting married is a settler colonial imposition, and Native peoples didn't have the idea of marriage, and this was brought in. Interestingly, in the Israeli context, when it's pointed out to defenders of Hamas that they're very anti-gay and that they're very practice violence against gay people, one of the responses is, well, that's because of British settler colonialism, that indigenous Arab culture didn't think that way, but it was settler colonialism that sort of taught them or forced them to think that way. And it's an example of how, like, everything bad has to go back to the same source. Everything bad has to go back to settler colonialism. So if you could just get rid of that settler colonialism, everything would be great. It's a very sort of unreal and utopian way of thinking that doesn't lead to any real concrete political action.
I'll just encourage anyone in the audience, if you have a question, you can throw it in the chat, and we'll see if there's time. I have 2 final questions for you, Adam, in terms of future directions. You conducted extensive research on settler colonialism studies in academia for this book, and it's focused specifically on the Israel-Palestinian conflict, to the exclusion of examples of settler colonialism in other regions. What do you anticipate is the future direction of this academic discipline?
Well, it really is a sort of Western self-criticism. That's where it comes from, and that's what the energy behind it is. So you could look at the history of the world and say there are lots and lots of examples of settler colonialism. In fact, practically everywhere is an example of settler colonialism. And there are a few historians who have done that, who have said, this is how, for example, ancient Greek cities were founded in this way, or the Roman Empire, or when Japan invaded China in the 1930s, that was an example of settler colonialism. You could even say what's going on right now in China in places like Tibet, and other regions where native peoples are being displaced and their language is being suppressed, to make them part of China, that's sort of a kind of settler colonialism too. But I don't think that those things are nearly as interesting to people who study this, because what they're really interested in is criticizing their own society, Western society, and in particular Israel as this sort of paradigm of Western society, saying everything that's wrong with Western society is concentrated here in Israel. So I think that the future is, academic trends do sort of rise and fall, and I think settler colonialism is trendy at the moment. Maybe for the last 10 years, it's been pretty in, and eventually new things come and take its place. But I do think that this basic way of thinking is not going to change anytime soon.
We began by discussing your motivation for writing the book. What has been the reception of the book since it's been published, and has it achieved your objective?
I think that it's been interesting. The book has been warmly received by Jewish audiences and sort of conservative publications where you would expect the arguments to be well received. And it has been basically ignored by other publications rather than being argued with or even like reviewed negatively. It's basically just been ignored. I've only really had one review that actually argued with the book by an Israeli academic who teaches in, maybe he's not Israeli, who teaches in South Africa, wrote about it and sort of argued back against it. But I do think it's a sign that people don't like to listen to, especially now. It's very easy to just not listen to opposing arguments. Like, we each live in our own little media universe, and we hear the things that we want to hear, and the other things we just tune out and ignore. So that's been a little disappointing. There hasn't been more sort of arguing back against it. Even maybe from some of the people who I talk about in the book, like, have not argued back against it. What I think I wanted to do is sort of explain for readers who don't understand what's going on, particularly on campuses with regards to Israel, to sort of give some explanation as to why this is happening and what the ideas behind it are. And I do think that it's accomplished that.
A final question from an audience member. Why has Israel's narrative about the return of an indigenous people to its homeland never caught on?
That's a good question. And I see this new comment, which I was not aware of, this thing about a contingent from an Indian tribe speaking in support of Israel at the United Nations. I think that it has to do with the fact that in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israelis have the upper hand right now. Oh, I see. Not the UN General Assembly. That Israel has the upper hand, so they're in the position of the conqueror rather than the conquered, and it's usually think of the native people, the indigenous people, as the one that's been conquered. So the Jews were conquered by the Romans 2,000 years ago, but in the present day, the Jews are the ones who are sort of holding power over the Palestinians. And so that's one reason why people don't like to think about Jews as an indigenous people, because they're not powerless. The idea that indigeneity means you were conquered and colonized, and therefore you're powerless. And then I think that the way that people see Israel is often shaped by the way that they see America or their own countries. And because the way we think about race and color in this country, I think people often apply that to Israel in a sort of uninformed way, both about the past and the present of Israel, thinking that Israel is sort of like a European colony, not realizing that in fact there's a lot of racial and ethnic diversity among Jews in Israel, especially now, even if not in 1948, and that the idea that this is a sort of racial discrimination regime, which is something that was like Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example, who wrote a book about this recently called The Message, compare it to like South Africa with racial apartheid, that those are familiar ways of thinking about oppression that don't really meet what's happening in Israel. And it's another example of how the sort of theory is applied without looking at what's actually happening there.
Thank you, Adam, so much for raising our awareness and the level of discourse on this particularly relevant and provocative topic. Appreciate your time and your thought.
Thank you, and thank you for everybody for listening tonight.
Thanks. Thank you all for joining us, and have a good night.